is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Finland must apply for NATO membership without delay. The message from the country's president and prime minister. Sweden is also expected to apply to join.
Moscow warns there'll be consequences if Finland joins NATO, calling it a hostile move which poses a direct threat to Russia's security.
We're spending less in the UK and the risk of recession is beginning to bite. The economy shrank in March just as the country was recovering from COVID.
And look away now if you're a Bitcoin investor. Bitcoin plunges to a 16-month low as the entire crypto market slumps. We're live in New York. Finland must apply for NATO membership without delay. That's the message from the country's president and prime minister.
The decision marks a radical change in the country's security policy after neighbouring Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Parliament could approve the decision by next week, with Sweden also expected to apply to join the military alliance. Our correspondent Michael Voss reports.
Finns have a reputation for reticence, so the announcement of a major foreign policy U-turn ending decades of détente to join NATO came in a written statement, not a televised address. Signed by both the President and the Prime Minister, it said that NATO membership would strengthen Finland's security and strengthen the entire defence alliance, and that Finland must apply without delay. Speaking earlier, President Niinistö said that this was purely a defensive move.
For us, joining NATO would be not against anybody. We would like to maximize our security in way or another while thinking membership in NATO. But it is not a zero-sum game. If Finland increases its security, it's not away from anybody else.
President Putin, though, doesn't see it that way. He believes NATO expansion poses a direct threat to Russian security. It's one reason he launched his attack on Ukraine. Now he's threatening military and political repercussions if Finland and Sweden join.
We can expect a lot of hostile statements from Russia. We can expect then some hybrid interference, so intimidation of different types, military exercises, perhaps missile tests, talking up the nuclear threat, hybrid interference, cyber attacks, malware, etc. So nobody in Finland is expecting this to be an easy ride.
Finland shares a 1,300-kilometre border with Russia, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Arctic, which will double the length of NATO's border with Russia. Finland has a large, well-trained army that has long cooperated with NATO through its Progress for Peace programme. But now, looking at Ukraine, it apparently feels it needs the protection full NATO membership offers, where an attack on one is an attack on all. On Wednesday, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson signed security pacts with both Sweden and Finland, offering support against any Russian threats, while these Nordic countries wait to be accepted into NATO. That process could take another year. We're now waiting to hear if Sweden will join NATO as well, a decision which could come in the next few days. Michael Voss, CGTN, Helsinki.
Well, the head of NATO has said Finland will receive a warm welcome to the military alliance, with a similar response from other member states. Let's talk to our correspondent Ryan Thompson, watching events for us in Brussels. Ryan, tell us more about the West's response to Finland's NATO ambitions.
Hi there, Jamie. Well, this has been weeks in the making. It's come as no real surprise to Brussels. But of course, diplomats here, whether they're at NATO or at the European Union, have welcomed Finland's announcement with open arms, even just minutes after Finland produced this declaration this morning. We heard from Estonia saying that they would really welcome this acceptance into NATO because it will provide much needed security for the bloc. Hours later, we heard a similar message from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying that he had actually spent time on the phone with Finland's president, offering to provide Germany's unilateral support for this application when it is officially launched in the coming days. We've also heard from members of the NATO alliance that aren't even on the European continent, including John Kirby, the U.S. Pentagon spokesperson. He was on MSNBC in the United States earlier saying that this is a historic moment and he welcomes it. No official word yet from Joe Biden, but sources in the U.S. have suggested that the U.S. president is favorable to this application, and we do expect them to be one of many countries to support it in the coming weeks when it actually is something in the process at NATO headquarters. Jamie, you mentioned Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. Immediately after this announcement, we heard from him suggesting that he would look to have this application fast-tracked given the circumstances that surround the security situation on Europe right now. Notably, this could include potentially the fastest accession into NATO from what we've seen so far in the history of the alliance.
And if Finland's application is received, what timescale might we then expect for membership?
Well, there's no exact recipe here for how long it will take from the application. The first step, of course, Jamie, is for this to go from an announcement from the government that they are supportive of the measure to actually depositing that application and sending off the required documents and studies, etc., to NATO headquarters for review. That could potentially happen as soon as Sunday for Finland. And if they are joined as well by Sweden, as many people and many reporting has suggested, well, then that could also go in tandem. If it is not Sunday, it's likely to happen on Monday of next week in the early stages. And then we expect a review process to continue up until what will be the NATO summit in Madrid later in June. That is likely to be when a final decision will be rendered, suggesting that the two countries will join. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there has been no opposition to the two countries coming aboard within the military alliance, so it is likely to be a smooth application process, just taking a little bit of time for the studying of documents, the necessary procedures to actually go ahead.
Ryan Thompson in Brussels, thank you very much.
Well, Moscow has warned there will be consequences if Finland joins NATO, calling it a hostile move which poses a direct threat to Russia's security. Well, our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Moscow, and a reminder that reporters in Russia are working under laws that restrict what they can say. Stuart, Russia has threatened to retaliate to this likely expansion of NATO.
Yeah, firstly, to understand Russia's reaction, it's necessary to acknowledge that Russia sees NATO not just as a defensive military bloc, as it claims, and so when a country joins, it gets concerned, and that's exactly what sparked the special operation in Ukraine, according to the president, because it was worried that more countries, including potentially Ukraine, would join the bloc. And now that's exactly what's happened. And so for Russia, the Kremlin is saying that this will be a threat, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said it will be taking the necessary retaliatory actions. Military technical in nature, it says those will be. A vague statement, but it's exactly the same phrase that was used months ago before the so-called operation began in Ukraine. So we don't know what exactly Russia will do, but one high-ranking parliamentarian, the deputy chairman of Russia's Defense Committee, has suggested there will be an increase of military activity to the northwestern region of Russia that borders Finland, that it's likely we will see more missile systems deployed up there. And previously, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had suggested it would deploy nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, the exclave of Russia that borders the Baltic. And that would be another potential move that Russia may take. If Finland does join, and Sweden too, that would completely cut off that exclave from the rest of Russia in terms of being surrounded by NATO states, and that's an additional fear for Russia.
Killed on home soil. What more do we know about that?
The first time this has happened, indeed. One Russian citizen killed, allegedly the region's governor says due to Ukrainian shelling. It wouldn't be the first time that Ukrainian shelling has ended up on the other side of the border. This particular village is around 10 kilometres from the border, and the region itself is in a yellow state of amber alert for terrorism, and that means that people have been advised to leave, but many still remain, and this is one clearly of those villages where people have chosen to stay. 7 people injured as well, and many buildings hit, including schools and homes, as well as cars. And so in response, the Kremlin says that security at the border regions where Russian oblasts meet Ukrainian ones should be increased. The Kremlin spokesperson, though, Dmitry Peskov, said he would leave the details to the Ministry of Defense. There's been no broader reaction calling on any kind of repercussions, and some analysts consider this maybe because Russia does not want to increase the level of fear about the special military operation, preferring for it to be viewed as something taking place 1,000 kilometers away from Moscow at a neighbouring country, and not something that is threatening Russian civilians. But clearly, this latest incident evidenced that there are repercussions for Russians too.
Stuart, many thanks. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
Well, in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky has given his support to Finland over its ambitions to join NATO. Let's talk to the Associated Press correspondent Kieran McQuillan in Lviv. Kieran, what more has President Zelensky been saying?
We had a very brief tweet about 6 hours ago from President Zelensky's office. I suspect that we will hear a little bit more a little bit later when he gives his usual evening address on Ukrainian TV and by social media channels. But he did say that he spoke to his Finnish counterpart. He said that they discussed Ukraine's European integration as well as Ukrainian and Finnish integration. But most of all, he said he commended the readiness of Finland to apply for NATO membership. And it's a little bit of a paradoxical situation, I think, for Ukraine and for President Zelensky at the moment, because right now, I guess Ukraine would like to be in that same situation on the verge of joining NATO. Of course, that's been ruled out so far, but as you can see, Finland have made a very strong positive step towards joining the bloc.
Kieran, the United Nations says they'll decide if there's to be an investigation into claims that Russian troops in Ukraine committed war crimes. What more do we know?
So just in the last hour, this resolution has now been passed by the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Now, this potentially paves the way for a formal United Nations investigation into war crimes in areas that were formerly held by Russia in Ukraine as they invaded after the 24th of February. That includes these images that we've seen from areas like Bucha and Irpin. Now, it was passed by 33 votes with 12 abstentions. Only China and Eritrea were the only 2 countries to vote against. This is a 47-member council. Russia was excluded earlier this year. So it is quite a strong and robust vote in favour of this potential investigation. Now, how this investigation will take place, we don't know. We know that in the past there have been UN investigations into war crimes in Kosovo and Eritrea. They could be possible templates for this. And this all comes against the backdrop of the Prosecutor General here in Ukraine. Her name is Irina Verdiktova. She has announced the first prosecutions of Russian servicemen for murder of unarmed Ukrainians. President Volodymyr Zelensky has warned that Kiev is losing patience with Russia over these war crimes, finding it more difficult to sit down for talks, for these alleged war crimes, finding it difficult to sit down with Russia for talks moving forward.
Kieran, thanks for that. Kieran McQuillan from the Associated Press in torrential rain, by the sound of it, in Lviv.
The German technology group Siemens is pulling out of Russia as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. Siemens employs around 3,000 people in Russia and has a very long history in the country after first setting up an office there in 1851. The decision is expected to cost the company more than $600 million in the second quarter. Shares have dropped 5%.
Shell has agreed to sell its Russian retail businesses to the country's oil giant Lukoil for an undisclosed sum. It's the first big deal in the gas and oil sector since the invasion of Ukraine, with Shell one of many Western companies which have pledged to leave Russia. Shell says the sale, which includes more than 400 gas stations, will protect 350 jobs.
Disney Plus added nearly 8 million new subscribers to its streaming service in the first quarter, escaping the audience switch-off that has plagued its rival Netflix. But it reported disappointing second-quarter results, with a warning that supply chain disruptions and rises in wages could put pressure on future earnings.
Apple is no longer the world's most valuable company. A sell-off in the technology sector saw the iPhone maker lose the #1 spot to Saudi Aramco. The oil giant is worth $2.4 trillion, and Apple's market valuation has dipped below that for the first time in 2 years.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Is a windfall tax on energy companies the key to helping hard-pressed families? Disagreements between the UK's Prime Minister and Finance Minister.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Now, bad news if you're a Bitcoin investor. It's plunged to a 16-month low in a sell-off for the whole cryptocurrency market. Our correspondent John Terrett is in New York. So, John, billions of crypto dollars have been lost in just the past few weeks.
Yeah, you know, they really have. I'm so glad we're doing this on the program today, because this is such an interesting topic, and most people don't really understand cryptocurrency. I like to say that it is still, even today, the wild, wild west of investing. You must be very, very careful. There's limited regulation. Anything could happen at any moment, as we're now seeing. Having said that, though, I really do think that cryptocurrencies are absolutely here to stay, though there may be many changes along the way before we get to the final form of them. Now, what's happened in the past 24 hours news cycle or so is that a company called Coinbase, which is really a sort of crypto brokerage, it was formed in San Francisco in 2012, and it's one of those virtual companies now. They don't have any offices anywhere, but you can go to them and buy and sell and trade all sorts of cryptocurrency. They came to the market here in a real fanfare at the height of the COVID epidemic, but they've just turned in some earnings, and they were terrible. They were absolutely awful. But worse than that, they warned that if they go bankrupt, then their millions of clients will probably lose all of their portfolio of cryptocurrency. And that is really rattling the crypto world at the moment. And then on top of that, there is a cryptocurrency which you probably haven't heard of, to be fair. It's called UST. It's what they call a stable coin. Now, stable coins are those that are attached to things like oil or gold, or in this case, the US dollar. And what's happened with UST is it's become unpegged from the US dollar. And the reason for that is so many people have been withdrawing their money that there's now no confidence at all in the blockchain system that supports UST and other currencies like it. There's a real lack of confidence. So for that reason, when I checked a few minutes ago, Bitcoin was at 29.2. Earlier today, it was at 27. And that's about 58 to 60% down from its all-time high of a couple of years ago. And even Ethereum, which is the one that crypto fans and believers really believe in, it's the second largest cryptocurrency. Ethereum is the one that has the almost perfect blockchain behind it. It is generally thought. Even that one is sharply, sharply down today.
So, John, does this mean that regulation on cryptocurrencies is likely sooner rather than later?
Well, the guy behind Ethereum, or one of them, one of the co-founders of Ethereum, is called Charles Hoskinson. And oddly enough, he is a cattle rancher as well. He has an estate in Wyoming, so he's rounding up steers half the time and very, very big in the crypto world the rest of the time. And he's just given an interview to Fox Business here in America, in which he says he thinks that this turbulence that we have in the crypto world now is pushing regulation back by 3 years to about 2025. And he says that politicians in D.C., like Mr. Biden, Elizabeth Warren, the senator, Gary Gensler, who is the head of the leading regulator of the SEC, they don't really understand cryptocurrency. They're a bit afraid of it, really. But the younger politicians in Washington, D.C. do get it. And he is saying today that what's needed is a change of the old guard in Washington, D.C. In other words, a new, younger president to come in and a new, younger Congress to come in. And then and only then will the sort of crypto world be taken really seriously and proper regulation will be enshrined. Now, that said, Biden does have a cryptocurrency committee which is looking into all of this, and I know that the US is looking into what they call a CBDC, which is a central bank digital currency, as is China, by the way. But I think both Beijing and Washington are relatively cautious at this stage, and as Charles Hoskinson is saying, it's going to take a younger crowd in there, particularly in Washington, before they really get to grips with it.
John, thanks very much. That's our correspondent, John Terrett in New York.
Let's talk about the UK, because fears of a recession are growing after the economy shrank unexpectedly last month. Activity fell by 0.1% in March as consumers cut back on spending amid the rising cost of living. Well, let's talk to Vicky Price, the distinguished economist who's a board member at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. I guess that you're going to say this is a load of factors. What are the main factors that set the UK economy on this set of results?
I think the main thing we're seeing right now is that consumer confidence is dropping and dropping very substantially because we're having a cost of living crisis. Of course, loads of countries are suffering from similar problems. We see that across Europe, where in fact there was recession in some of the countries, or rather drop in GDP in some of the countries in the first quarter. We've at least escaped that, so we still have an increase in overall GDP of 0.8%, which means that we're way above pre-pandemic levels, which is good news. But unfortunately, if you look at it on a monthly basis, it was 0 in February in terms of growth, and it was just 0.1% in March drop. And that, of course, suggests that, if you carry on with those trends that we're seeing at present, we could indeed end up with the second quarter seeing a decline in GDP, which some economists are forecasting right now.
And do you think we're likely to see a recession?
It's possible. It's being forecast actually by the Bank of England, which is looking at particularly what will be happening towards the end of this year and into next year, where they have adjusted their growth forecast for next year to a negative figure, and that's pretty worrying. Yes, I think we could get a recession, but I think what's going to happen is that governments are going to step in, as they're doing in other countries, and give more support. Of course, we also don't know what's going to happen to oil prices. More generally, we don't know what's going to happen to food prices. But the consumer is certainly feeling quite poor right now because inflation is rising faster than wages. I think the government is going to have to intervene and particularly help those at the lower pay end of the wage bracket, and also those who rely on benefits, and do something to relieve some of those pressures that are out there. What that will mean is more spending by the government, more borrowing possibly, but at least I think it will mean that the sort of pressure on consumers and living standards might be eased, so things could improve a little bit. My worry is mainly on manufacturing, investment. We've had huge input costs, of course, increasing very significantly for some sectors of the economy. Whether they'll be able to pass those to the consumer is questionable, and investment does not seem to be picking up as we had forecast. So growth ahead does not look too rosy.
In a global squeeze, domestic political policy levers can be sometimes rather pointless. Which policies do you think might work to ease this UK economic pressure?
Well, one of the things that can be done is ease the pressure on energy bills, household energy bills. We have very high energy bills by comparison to loads of other countries in Europe. In other places, they have capped prices quite considerably. We haven't really done that. So something needs to give there. So and I think something will happen. In addition, really supporting those on benefits in particular, but also looking at what can be done with industry. There has been a lot of concern that all those energy-intensive sectors have suffered quite significantly, and that's why we're not seeing that investment happening. A bit of direct help would also assist. On the other hand, what we seem to be doing in the UK is raise interest rates a lot faster than has been happening in Europe, where, of course, we've hardly seen that at all. There will be an increase in Europe too, but we seem to have gone ahead a bit earlier than others, and that is adding to pressure for firms as well, who have, in fact, borrowed rather a lot during COVID.
You've seamlessly led us on to our next story, as I'd expect. Thank you so much for coming on the programme. Vicky Pryce, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The UK Finance Minister says no options are off the table as calls grow for the government to introduce a windfall tax on energy companies.
Opposition parties want to tax the soaring profits of oil and gas companies and help households that are struggling to pay their bills.
Our correspondent Naweed Barkle has been following the story. So, Naweed, we're seeing two very different views on UK windfall taxes for energy companies from the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Finance Minister Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, that's right. We've just been hearing about the sorts of pressures people are facing across the country, so the government needs to think of a way to try and deal with the cost of living crisis. In its Queen's speech a few days ago, it's outlined a few things, but not really dramatic enough. Now the idea of a windfall tax is being considered, we're told, by the Treasury, something, by the way, that the main opposition party has been talking about for months. The Labour Party has called for this, the government resisting, and it seems that they are now thinking about the idea. If you look at the companies doing well in recent months, the oil and gas industry, we've all seen energy prices rise for consumers, but the likes of BP, for example, and Shell, BP in the first quarter of this year, its profits doubled to more than $6 billion. If you take Shell, it's done even better. It's tripled to more than $9 billion. So it's an issue of fairness, according to some politicians. And what we have seen from Boris Johnson is him saying that he doesn't really like these sorts of windfall taxes because they may actually hurt investment coming into the country. And that's something that he said earlier on today.
The disadvantage with those sorts of taxes is that they deter investment in the very things that we need to see them putting their money. They need to be investing in new technology, in new energy supply.
But the bosses say it won't deter them on investing.
Well, you know, then you know we'll have to look at it. But
so are you saying you will look at windfall taxes?
I want them to make those investments.
On the other hand, Rishi Sunak saying that this is something that the Treasury is now looking at. If you look at what the outcome could possibly be, it's important to remember that oil and gas companies already are taxed heavily in the UK. The corporation tax here for normal businesses is 19%. They pay 30% plus a supplementary tax of about 10%, so already paying twice as much. What Labour want to see is that risen to 50%. It says that will free up about $2.5 billion more to try and help offset some of these energy bills. It will lead to about savings of more than $700 for each family. But politically, it's a bit of a difficult place for the government now, because if they go ahead with this, they're going to be accused of copying a policy and holding off on something for 5 months. But something needs to be done. Their fiscal measures, as we were hearing from Vicky, are quite restrained. They've already raised taxes quite a lot. So looking at taxing businesses instead, a way to help ordinary people.
Now, the other big political story we must talk about is this huge row between the EU, the UK government over Northern Ireland. The UK government has now given the EU a deadline before it scraps what's called the Northern Ireland Protocol. What's going on?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people will be looking at this, especially on a day like today, where Boris Johnson's in Scandinavia, strikes new international agreements with Sweden and France, and here with its biggest trading partner next door, the European Union, it risks overriding an international agreement it already has in place. The protocol, part of the Brexit agreement when Britain left the European Union. And what it's done is its implementation has been pretty tricky, Downing Street says, the UK government. It's led to lots of costs for businesses, lots of paperwork, for example, and political troubles in Northern Ireland as well. So we've reached this stage now where Britain says unless the EU starts to change on that deal, that it will take unilateral action. Liz Truss, who's leading the negotiations for the UK government, has reportedly said there's only 72 hours left. By Monday, they want to try and scrap parts of the protocol, which would be potentially very consequential. They have been given some form of green light from the UK government. The chief law officer for the UK government, Suella Braverman, she says that given the current peace and stability impact in Northern Ireland, the fact that this is potentially risking the Good Friday Agreement, which ended largely 3 decades of violence, that the UK is within its legal right to act. But the message from Brussels, very, very different. The two sides' parliaments have been talking to each other, and just have a listen to what the Europeans have to make about this suggestion.
I don't think that any unilateral move to get out of the protocol would be a wise one, neither for people in Northern Ireland nor for the UK as a strong member of the free world and of an alliance of democracies.
The alliance of democracies she touched upon there. We have a cost of living crisis that we've been hearing about over the past few minutes. Is this really a time to be picking a trade war with your biggest trade partner? Lots of people would say perhaps not, but the other big issue is the war in Ukraine. What impact will that have for two allies, the UK and the EU, standing together when such important global issues are at stake?
Naweed, thanks for that. Our correspondent, Naweed Jabarkil.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Ukraine's foreign minister is in Germany, where the army is training Ukrainians on one of their most powerful weapons systems.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Marawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just gotta be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
It's the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front line. Within clear view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Finland must apply for NATO membership without delay. The message from the country's president and prime minister. Sweden is also expected to apply to join.
But Moscow warns there'll be consequences if Finland joins the military alliance, calling it a hostile move which poses a direct threat to Russia's security.
Well, the former Prime Minister of Finland, Alexander Stubb, has been telling CGTN that Finland joining NATO is now inevitable.
You know, there is nothing better than fear or rational fear that drives you. And I think the Finns were looking at the situation in 2008 after the war in Georgia. I called for a rejuvenation of the NATO debate at the time, didn't heed much answers. Then in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, people got a little bit worried. But then when they saw a full-blown conflict in Ukraine and they saw what Putin can do to his Slavic brothers and sisters, the conclusion was that, listen, if he can do that, the murderous things that he's doing to them, he would be able to do it elsewhere. And then the conclusion after that was very simple. So de facto, I think the decision for us to join NATO was taken at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 24th of February. NATO membership, you don't have to do everything that you're asked to do, but I think you will see a Nordic profile for Finland and Sweden in NATO. So we will coexist as comfortably with NATO membership as Norway, Denmark and Iceland have since 1949. I presume it's going to be one of the quickest processes that we've seen in accession, and the reason is very simple. Finland and Sweden are more NATO compatible than most NATO member states. So for the past 30 years, we've been so close to NATO in operations, in trainings, in military equipment, that it is very easy for us to join pretty much overnight. But I would assume that the ratification process takes 2 to 3 months.
Ustav also said Russia will become more isolated and told us why he doesn't think Finns should worry about threats from Moscow.
This is actually Putin's enlargement. We have to understand that this would not have happened in Finland and Sweden had not Russia and Putin attacked Ukraine on the 24th of February. Secondly, there will be obviously some threats, but that's quite normal. But we don't expect any conventional. So it'll be more on the hybrid, cyber and information space. But I don't think Finns, nor our political leadership, nor the Swedes should be excessively worried. I think Russia has its hands full in Ukraine at the moment. And to be honest, to put it diplomatically, not exactly doing a stellar job. I think, first of all, this is self-inflicted pain with Russia. We have to remember that they have violated international law. They have tried to craft spheres of interest and violated the territorial integrity of a sovereign nation state, namely Ukraine. So this would not have happened without the Russian attack. What's going to happen next is that Russia will be fully isolated, politically, economically, financially, sports, culture, energy, traffic. We will have a Europe split into two, with Russia on one side, and Russia is authoritarian, totalitarian, aggressive, revisionist, and imperialistic. On the other side, you have 40 European states, all of which are democracies, believe in international cooperation, human rights, fundamental rights, and rule of law. And these 40 states will have different types of membership, some in NATO, some in the EU, some in both, some in neither. But this will be the reality of a divided Europe for the foreseeable future. Do I like it personally? No. I would love to have Russia being a peaceful, rich, prosperous neighbor like Sweden, but unfortunately, that's not the reality at the moment, so we'll just have to wait and see.
Jamie Shea is former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Emerging Security Challenges. I asked him how Finland and Sweden would strengthen the military alliance.
Well, I think in a number of ways, Robin. First and foremost, these are two countries which have always interpreted their neutrality as armed neutrality, a willingness to defend their territories. And as a result, they've been spending and modernising their militaries for territorial defence. I mean, Finland in particular has 5 very well-equipped, heavy armoured brigades to defend its 1,300 kilometre-long border with Russia. It also has a substantial reserve force of about 215,000. And recently, Finland decided to buy American F-35 aircraft. Sweden has bought the US Patriot system. So these are countries which are really bringing something to the NATO table, perhaps in a way that previous countries joining NATO over the last decade or so haven't been able to do so. So from a military point of view, they will definitely strengthen NATO's posture in the Baltic and Northern European areas. The other way I think they're going to help is that one of NATO's big headaches since Putin annexed Crimea in 2014 has been how to defend the Baltic states, which are geographically distant from the rest of NATO, particularly Latvia and Estonia. And having Finland in particular in the alliance is really going to give NATO much greater control of the Baltic Sea and therefore a much better ability to defend the Baltic states and Poland as well. And as a result, I think this will have a larger deterrent impact on Russia.
Well, I wanted to explore that point, actually. Do you think that with a strengthened NATO, that will be a deterrent for Russia?
Yes, I do. I think, number one, that President Putin clearly is bogged down at the moment in his campaign in Ukraine. The Russian army's not been performing well, so I doubt that he will realistically be able to attack Finland or Sweden to prevent them, for example, from joining NATO. Secondly, as I've said, these two countries have made it clear to Russia for many years that they would resist any kind of Russian attack, and they have the defence forces, even without NATO membership, to put up serious resistance. I think, yes, the Russians will huff and puff. They won't like it, particularly as Putin based part of his campaign against Ukraine, on the assumption that this would prevent further NATO enlargement, and it's precisely the opposite of what is happening. I also think that the Russians will probably respond, as they always do, with the familiar disinformation campaigns, the cyber attacks, the violations of Swedish and Finnish airspace. But frankly, Robin, these activities have been going on already before Sweden and Finland said that they were interested in joining NATO. And again, they've been counterproductive for Russia in that they've heightened the perception of a Russian threat and only accelerated the desire of Finland and Sweden to give up non-alignment and come into the NATO family.
So how do you think this reflects on the future of NATO? Are we seeing a new age in Western Europe, and do you think we'll see more countries join?
Well, certainly I think it means that as the West sees this onslaught from the autocracies, hostile rhetoric, the reckless use of military force in launching unprovoked aggressions against their neighbours, I certainly think it helps that the Western family is drawing closer together. For example, with Finland and Sweden in NATO, there will now be 23 EU countries, which are also NATO countries. I think it's good news for the United States when it comes to burden sharing, because the US Congress sees that the Europeans are now willing to do more for their own defense. I think, again, it will really make it more difficult for Putin to launch further military adventures once Finland and Sweden are also in the alliance as well. And I think generally it simply shows that the West is not prepared simply to sit back idly and swallow this Russian aggression. There is this strong desire to counter it and to do something about it and to make it clear that the liberal democracies are determined to defend their territory. So I think, yes, I think it's a good thing for the West, a bad thing for President Putin, and that is no bad thing.
Ukraine's foreign minister is visiting Germany. He's met the leaders of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's Social Democratic Party. German troops have started training their Ukrainian counterparts on some of their most powerful weapons systems. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin. Trent, what do you think the Ukrainian foreign minister hopes to achieve in these face-to-face meetings?
Well, I think the key objective for the Foreign Minister would be to have some sit-down time with key backbenchers here from the German Parliament. We've seen him tweeting all day photographs of him meeting with key representatives from Olaf Scholz's party to Angela Merkel's former Conservative Party, the FDP, the Greens, and I think the idea behind that is trying to continue to drum up support at a political level here in Germany for more weapons to go to Ukraine. Of course, the German Defence Forces have always been a little bit hesitant to export, especially heavy weaponry. That is because in Parliament there is quite a strong pacifist movement, especially within the SPD, an idea that we shouldn't get involved in Ukraine. But nevertheless, we are seeing the tide start to turn. As you mentioned, the Panzerhaubitze 2000 system is now going to be going to Ukraine, to Ukrainian forces there. Now, this is arguably one of the best and most advanced artillery systems in the world. It's on tracks, it can drive quite fast. In military terms, they say it can shoot and scoot at about 40 kilometres away accurately against targets, but it is quite complex, and so we do know that Ukrainian forces are now here being trained in Germany so they can take that system back and hopefully then, from their perspective, deploy it, especially in the eastern half of Ukraine, and really try and push back against that shelling from the Russian side.
Trent, what else does Ukraine's foreign minister have planned for his German visit?
Well, his visit comes just as a special G7 foreign ministers summit is getting underway tonight here in Germany, local time, and we know that Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, has invited him to attend on behalf of the Ukrainian government. Of course, we expect there'll be plenty of discussion again on that issue of weapons, but also other questions like energy security and possibly even further sanctions against Russia. But there will also be a discussion, we understand, around these growing concerns about food shortages. We know that millions of tons of grain is held up in Ukrainian ports right now, unable to leave the Black Sea and then venture out into key export markets in other parts of the world. The Ukrainians say that the Russian Navy is responsible for that. They've effectively blockaded the area. The German foreign minister, speaking this afternoon as that G7 meeting got underway, said she wants to make that a key priority to try and unblock that blockade, if you will, and get that grain out, especially into the developing world.
Trent, thanks for that. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin.
The war in Ukraine has sparked a rethink over international diplomacy in Switzerland, where military neutrality is part of the constitution.
After widespread condemnation of Russia, a referendum on future involvement in the Ukraine conflict seems increasingly likely. Our correspondent Johannes Pleshberger reports.
For the Swiss, neutrality is as sacred as their mountain peaks and the holes in their Emmental cheese. This is supported by the high approval ratings for military non-alignment, which are consistently above 95%. But Russia's war on Ukraine has also left its mark, sparking a parliamentary debate on how exactly future neutrality should be defined. The Bayern government, which is aligned with the EU through many treaties, currently supports all European sanctions against Russia.
The Swiss neutrality has been very flexible in the past. So Switzerland joined the United Nations in 2002 and works with the Partnership for Peace in NATO. But we have a debate in Switzerland now, and there will be a referendum to go back to the traditional Swiss neutrality.
Several parties support this proposal to let the people decide the definition of neutrality, perhaps returning to its traditional stance, cutting itself off from geopolitics altogether, or turning to an even more flexible form of neutrality, meaning delivering arms to Ukraine. Under Swiss law, it is required to treat parties to a conflict equally when it comes to exporting munitions or military goods.
This law is quite precise. So that's the reason why Switzerland does not export any munition or military goods to Ukraine or Russia.
It is not only Switzerland that is debating its neutrality. Neighboring Austria is also reflecting on how it should handle its military non-alignment as the brutal Russia-Ukraine conflict drags on.
Austria as a country should remain neutral, but we shouldn't also be afraid to speak our mind.
I don't think this is the solution to send weapons, but to send also like a lot of resources to them.
And we should stay with neutrality. And if really the rockets are flying, so we are out of this. So Austria would be not a target of this.
Moscow's actions have triggered a rethink on how they navigate their traditional neutrality, as the war in Ukraine pushes the international community to choose sides. Johannes Pleshberger, CGTN, Vienna.
The Greek foreign minister has been welcoming counterparts from Bulgaria and Romania for talks.
Top of their agenda, how to reduce their reliance on Russian liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
Our correspondent Evangelos Sipsas reports from Athens.
War in Ukraine and the resulting energy crisis dominated the talks between Greece, Bulgaria and Romania. Bulgaria has been particularly hard hit after its gas supply have been cut off since Russia's Gazprom demanded its payments in rubles, in which Bulgaria failed to do. The three countries discussed on how they can work together and make a better use of its gas and electrical infrastructure, and how they're going to bring energy to the region safely without its citizens having to pay a hefty price.
Energy security and interconnectivity is the #1 concern. We don't want to make European citizens pay the high price and also abstain from what is our ultimate goal to have greener energy.
The meeting comes just days after Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis inaugurated a new LNG terminal station in the northern city of Alexandroupolis, hoping to make the city a new energy getaway that will help Europe and the Balkans become less reliant on Russian supplies. The Bulgarian Deputy Foreign Minister Vasil Georgiev said the LNG terminal in Greece was important, but remained deeply concerned about energy security in the region.
We are highly dependent on Russian natural gas, but thanks to the project with the interconnector and also the LNG terminal in Alexandroupolis, we are going to diversify our hopefully we are going to diversify the deliveries of natural gas.
However, Romania's deputy foreign minister voiced her worries about Europe's security and defense.
Moscow action put the entire European and Euro-Atlantic security architecture at high risk, and I need to repeat that. The war, it's not about Ukraine's security, it's not about the regional security of the Black Sea, but it is about threatening the European and Euro-Atlantic security as a whole.
The meeting followed Greece's announcements of plans to double its storage capacity at its LNG terminals and the creation of a pipeline between Greece and Bulgaria, which will deliver gas to the Balkans. The pipeline is expected to finish in June and become operational by July. Evangelos Sipsas for CGTN, Athens.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, her name is synonymous with modern nursing. Now, Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, has a museum dedicated to her work.
This week on Razor, the battle to save Australia's little blue penguins. A strategy which shows that when you set out to save an iconic species, you also save their whole ecosystem.
We're in the middle of the largest little penguin colony in the world. And the only places that the population are doing well are places that there's some conservation plans in place.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. The office of Sri Lanka's outgoing Prime Minister has been vandalised in anti-government protests in the capital, Colombo. Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned earlier this week after weeks of demonstrations over rising prices and energy blackouts. He's now reported to have gone into hiding.
About 20 multi-million-dollar mansions have been burnt in a wildfire in the United States. Fire crews were unable to stop the fast-moving wildfire in Laguna Niguel in California, which forced evacuations. The cause of the blaze is still under investigation.
DPRK leader Kim Jong-un has been pictured wearing a mask for the first time as he announced a strict lockdown after the country's first recorded cases of COVID-19. Previously, the government said there'd been no cases after it closed its borders.
At least 50 more fines have been issued as part of the investigation into illegal COVID lockdown breaches by the UK government. This follows more than 50 fines that were handed out last month, including one for the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who attended a party in Downing Street. Johnson was not fined this time, but the police are investigating 3 more gatherings that he did attend.
British nurse Florence Nightingale is seen as the founder of modern nursing. Working during the 19th century, she revolutionised healthcare.
Now, for the first time, a museum has been dedicated to her work. CGTN's correspondent Guy Henderson reports from London.
Florence Nightingale has been brought back to life. For the first time, a museum dedicated to her work launched 2 years after her 200th birthday because of the pandemic. Though in that time, of course, her stories only become more relevant.
This was the journey out to Crimea.
It was. Taking visitors back to the battlefields of the 1850s, where a few hundred voluntary nurses worked out that many thousands of soldiers were dying not from war, but from dirt.
This is where she realised that when she was nursing the sick and the wounded, that more of the soldiers were dying from preventable diseases than their battle wounds. And she started collecting data and statistics on that for the mortality rates month by month and the causes.
Another room here shows how Nightingale took her pioneering case for hygiene back to Britain, using new and highly persuasive techniques.
So these blue wedges are the important ones to look at, and they are the ones that are deaths caused by preventable diseases.
These graphs sparked a healthcare revolution.
We see infographics and data visualizations now every single day, and we've seen so many of them through the COVID pandemic. They remain such a powerful way to communicate information, and I just think it's amazing that the principles that Florence Nightingale stood for in the 1850s, data visualization, the use of data and evidence, are still just as relevant today.
A trailblazer for women as well, and the first female admitted to the Royal Statistical Society, despite what her confirmation letter said.
Florence Nightingale is widely seen as the founder of modern nursing and someone who completely changed the way people thought about human health.
Amongst many an enduring legacy was that simple message, wash your hands, something that saved countless lives this past 2 years. Director David Green says it's been worth the lockdown-induced delays.
Nightingale is certainly one of the most famous Victorian women in the world. Her very name is a benchmark for excellence in healthcare and in the fields of science. And so, really, telling her story was very important because it genuinely does act as an inspiration for others.
Opening its doors on what is also International Nurses' Day, a fitting tribute to an icon. Guy Henderson, CGTN, London.
Coronavirus has been a huge toll on our way of life, but it's also meant disruption for family pets.
Animal care centres in Shanghai have been especially busy during lockdown. Staff at one shelter say restrictions have forced many owners to find temporary homes for their pets. Our correspondent Chen Tong reports.
It's now a daily routine for Xia, a store manager at Kung Fu Dogs in Shanghai. Every afternoon, she goes out onto the lawn to play with kennels residents. Many are here because their owners simply couldn't guarantee their usual care due to COVID control measures. Xia says knowing their pets are safe and well gives them greater peace of mind during this difficult time.
Some owners wouldn't let their dogs defecate at home. Letting dogs stay at our place and receiving the videos we send to them is helping to relieve their anxiety.
Every dog has its own resting place here. Xia says from observing their mannerisms and daily habits, she's gradually come to realize the various needs of each one. For instance, some are happy with basic requirements, such as eating and sleeping. But others like to be spoiled, played with, and even feel like a member of the family. Xia also noticed one with anxiety, so she decided to sleep close to this dog at night.
Some pet owners have special needs. We also judge the situation of different dogs. Some owners think their dogs adapt well socially, but they don't like to stay with other dogs in such a public place.
Xia has been working in the pet industry for almost 10 years, but this is a new situation for her. She says taking care of dogs is no longer just a job, but it's become part of her life. So much so, she says she's constantly worrying about the fate of not just the animals under her care, but all animals during the pandemic.
If I'm infected at home, it doesn't really matter. I will just go to the quarantine site. But what if I got COVID here? How can I tell the pet owners? No matter whether it's a dog or a cat or another animal, they're all living creatures. Respecting life is a basic principle.
And with Shanghai's COVID situation slowly improving, Xia and her colleagues know their extra work is almost over. With some residential areas now lifting restrictions, owners are welcoming their pets back once again. Chen Tong, CGTN, Shanghai.
And finally, what would you do if the pilot of a plane you were flying in lost consciousness?
I've got a serious situation here. My pilot has gone incoherent. I have no idea how to fly the airplane.
What was the situation with the pilot?
He is incoherent. He is out.
Darren Harrison was flying from the Bahamas to the United States when he told air traffic controllers that he had a problem and that he wasn't sure where he was. Air traffic controller and flight instructor Robert Morgan was scrambled to give a flying lesson. He talked to Mr. Harrison through landing at Florida's Palm Beach Airport. The two men hugged when they met on the tarmac. The pilot is being treated in hospital. Well, it's time for us to take off now. That is it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.